I'm very excited about today and about joining you this way very briefly. I know that today is a day designed for having debates and conversations that I think are super necessary and important. So when I was invited to give a keynote in this context, I was really excited, and I have brought a short lecture with that in mind, with these debates and these challenges that I know you have already been discussing these last few days in mind. So I hope we can have a nice debate after I give this talk. So I brought a short presentation that I want to share with you while I talk. So it's going to be easier for me also not to lose my train of thought. And well, as you know already, this is the title of my talk, and I'm going to explain now. I'm putting just my two affiliations here, so you know where I'm coming from to the intersection of these two things. I participate in Centro de Análisis Socioambiental, which is an organization centered in the research around our civilizational crisis, our ecological crisis, and it's based in Chile. And we have been trying to bring critical approaches to what we understand as development and as progress and as growth, which are some of the things I'm going to be talking about now. And I also participate in the Red Chilena de Ingreso Básico Universal, which is the local Chilean node of the basic income network. We are very newly created, and also there we have been talking about these things and in conversation with other Latin American local networks, we have been touching on this debate. So I'm going to refer also to that, like what I'm telling you, it's also coming from those conversations, so that you know where I'm coming from, which I know is a different context from where you are now, and I think that's interesting, and it can be very enriching for conversation. So this is the roadmap of what I want to say today. I'm just going to make briefly 3 points and 3 proposals that I hope you'll find interesting to think with. And as I said, I take this as a conversation between comrades and people that I know we have a lot of concerns in common, so we hope we'll find common ground in what I bring you today. So this is basically overall, the one thing I want to do in this short lecture is to present you a proposition to see what degrowth and basic income have in common, both being radical proposals and that are often faced with similar arguments, and what these commonalities can show us in how they can help each other in achieving their goals and in achieving the horizons they envision. So first, degrowth and basic income. I want to talk about sufficiency beyond efficiency, which is a word that now has become a very common word to talk about when we talk about our ecological crisis. So first, I know I need to make this case, and because this is still a very emerging concept, which is why degrowth? Why am I choosing to talk about what it's commonly referred to as sustainability, and this is as degrowth? And this is basically because, as I say here, for me, sustainability does not go far enough. So I will make my point today in this very particular framework of what a livable future is, which is the idea of degrowth. That very basically, this approach implies the recognition of our wider ecological overshoot, the recognition of consumerism and productivism as a paired problem. I'm gonna talk about more of that later, and a historical baggage of growth as a colonial project and as a colonial civilizational project that we also need to address critically. And it's also, as I will say, the rejection of illusions of green growth as our way out of the crisis. So, as I said, my point choosing degrowth for this lecture is to show that there are affinities between these two agendas, and as they uphold counterintuitive principles, they mobilize counterintuitive principles in hegemonic debate. And they're, again, often ignored or sidelined in mainstream politics for similar reasons, same reasons. So first, the first point I want to make of this commonality is that both concepts share the guiding principle of acknowledging sufficiency to demand a better distribution in basic income. I would say a pre-distribution of wealth, of what we have as a society, as a political struggle. So this is important, giving a political meaning to sufficiency. So on the one hand, degrowth starts from the insight that we already produce more than enough to support everyone's well-being. And indeed, much of what we do and we produce is not even designed for our well-being. And here again, we could talk about many things, food waste, speculation in housing, fast fashion, etc. So what we need, the growth advocates say, more than improving efficiency, as the green growth discourse, is to bring in sufficiency in a way that focuses on historical reparations, the restoration of destroyed ecosystems, and the recovery of local autonomies that were destroyed by the enclosure of colonialism. So it has to do with recovering this political autonomy that has been eroded in the name of growth. It's through the recognition of enclosures as a foundational moment of capitalism and as an ongoing process that degrowth is a politically loaded call for reduction and redistribution, not just in material terms, but also power-wise. Right, because we can redistribute what we do with our natural resources, our materials, without challenging the structures of power. It cannot be reduced to just a technical proposal, a technical management, improvement in management. And I suggest that basic income fits this approach. In basic income, we often say that the total value of basic income, of the transfer of the money tag, it's much wider than the value goes beyond the monetary value of how much money we receive. So we think about basic income in political terms. We talk about human rights, we talk about inheritance, we talk about the recovery of the commons, which I think there is a very similar diagnosis than degrowth. And again, very similarly in both cases, when we're told that there is not enough, we don't have enough money to implement basic income, we usually point out that we already have more than enough to provide everyone. We only need to dare tapping the wealth where it's being hoarded, right? And often our response is, look at this very outrageous concentration of wealth, and how basic income is also about rechanneling that fracture of society into better and more equal ways of living. So this rechanneling of monetary wealth, that is the focus of basic income, follows a similar logic than degrowth. Degrowth points at the radical change in the collective use of raw materials and energy that goes into the sustenance of wasteful lifestyles that do not make us happy, and focus instead on public provision and what we really need, public provision of what we really need and what we actually enjoy, which is not what is being catered right now. And finally, and I think this is an interesting commonality, we can also think and talk about what is the price of not having a basic income, which is also very often referred to in debates, and think also what is the price of not degrowing. So we usually have to fight back these similar ideas of, basic income is too expensive. But then we can always point out what is the real full price of not having a basic income, right? Like what is the price of that we pay today as a society for choosing to keep people in poverty and dispossession and economic insecurity, when we have right next to each other such an abundant civilization and such a waste of wealth and such use of public wealth to private gain. And we can see the damage and the price that we pay for not having basic income in terms of the harm it does to our minds, to our bodies, like health-wise. I think it's a very useful way to think like how this affects our bodies, how poverty and how insecurity affects our physiology. And more important, I would say at this moment, our political capacity of living together in peace and of agreeing to different political arrangements. The price that we pay in that realm is very high. And I know that Angelina talked about this a few days ago, and I'm also going back to what the argument he made. And in degrowth, I would say we can often do the same, when people say, oh, but look at all the policies we would need to implement to degrow the economy. It's very expensive. We can't pay that price. But I would say, what is the full price? What is the real full price of continuing our current bet for decoupling and for eco-modernist fantasies, that we are already dilapidating our future when we do not take the end of the fossil fuel era seriously. So then we can start, like, if you start taking that into account, then the price money-wise that we could pay today to start thinking and implementing degrowth might actually be much lower. Okay, so that was my first point. The second point I want to make, it's about this sentence that might be already familiar for you at this point, if you were not familiar with this before coming to this conference. And again, I think it's an approach and a principle that fits and brings together degrowth and basic income really well, which is this idea of the power to say no as a form of freedom. And here, I want to talk very briefly about extractivism and about exiting extractivism as a modality of the global economy that even though it exists in its more harmful form in very specific places, for instance, in Chile, where I'm from, it is a feature of a globalized economy. So this is something that sustains our imperial way of life everywhere. Yeah, it's not just a problem that is localized in the places of extractions. So, exiting extractivism and the shared challenge of sacrificed lives and sacrificed territories. So, like two ways of talking about the same. So, I want to look into more details a shared element between basic income and degrowth as a struggle for more freedom, a concept that is often misunderstood. In basic income, we refer to the power to say no, to sustain that only an unconditional support of our livelihood makes us really free. If we are constantly begging and having to earn the bare minimum through exploitative work, we become hostages of our employers and getting into completely unfree forms of labor. The same happens in territories deemed as places of extraction. In them, what in Chile and in other places of Latin America we call sacrifice zones, these places that accumulate biological and ecological damage that goes unacknowledged and unaddressed through history, like it runs through time. The idea of bringing back work to an area or in maintaining work to an area in a particular place as a benefit for the communities that live there has been bringing more harm than good historically. And this, I want to be very emphatic in this, that this is a consistent pattern of places being targeted for extraction and for development, being coincidentally the poorest in the country, the ones with the lowest life expectancy. And I'm sure this is a pattern that happens in other places of the global south, but here I'm thinking about Latin America for obvious reasons. So indeed, implementing a basic income can work as a form of emergency exit of these very literally toxic situations, allowing people to reconstruct sacrifice zones in which corporations have become feudal lords. In a way, this feudal power that often works in a way that it's even defended by people themselves. And I think this is also crucial to keep in mind. And trying to break these relations of dependency is very difficult because often people really see forms of care from the corporations that are also destroying and damaging their own lands. Dependency under this extractive sacrificial modality comes often in the form of regular wages. And again, notoriously, wages in zones of extractions can be very low. They tend to be, as low as possible. That's what makes this extraction profitable to begin with. But they bring certainty. They bring the periodicity. I know that whatever happens by the end of the month, I'm gonna get my salary. And the periodicity and the certainty, it's highly valued by the families. Families that probably before the arrival of extractive industries relied on fluctuations of informal or seasonal labor. So I suggest in this situation that basic income could break that toxic bond and make people realize that the whole of society is committed to their well-being. not just the particular owners of corporate capital that happen to be interested in their territories, right? Like it's not because of their they're not employing them out of nowhere. It's because there's a very particular gain that they're getting from their work. So what if we transfer that sense of solidarity to the whole of society? That is what a basic income would do, and that would definitely change the political position of people living in these lands, in these territories. So second, and more broadly, basic income would allow us to move away from growth-oriented organizations of livelihoods. What we need really to stay alive and healthy is to sustain our livelihoods and not necessarily keep the economy, keep the full output of what we produce growing and growing, without an end of sight. And there are several ongoing conjunctures in which basic income could bring more freedom into the way we live, escaping also from extractivist extractivist and sacrificial logics. So it could definitely bring more autonomy to forms of production that today are heavily intervened by pro-growth logics. Notoriously food production, and I want to refer to this because I think it's when we think about scarcity and the need to produce more, I think we could think very often about people don't have food to eat, but this is not a problem of absolute scarcity. This is a problem of scarcity manufactured by the globalized food system. So today, food production is pervaded and encroached in its logic of debt by financialization, making use of maximizing and toxic, again, literally toxic tools of production like fertilizers and genetically modified organisms that are in practice mandatory to anyone trying to make a living, however bare, from growing food in the land. And very often, people dedicated to agriculture can't even afford to work their own land with freedom, even if they have it. And examples of how this changes with basic income, I think, are very interesting in, for instance, the pilots that some of our comrades have done from BN have done in India. And also, if you're interested in this topic, in conditional cash transfers in Latin America show similar patterns of how independence of farmers and people doing agriculture change when you have an income. So if we want to move to more regenerative, organic, and respectful ways of relating with the land, broadly speaking, including agriculture, but other forms, that allow time, for instance, for the soil to rest, that allow for the unpredictability of uneven yields, then basic income could definitely be a game changer, allowing to escape from these cycles of debt that are so present today. And again, all these considerations that I'm saying on what are the very practical challenges to transform our livelihoods in a degrowth context convert in some practical consequences to think about basic income in an ecologically minded way. So for instance, and I think this is an important example, the full implementation of basic income could start, not as it is often thought in a very socioeconomic stratification of we're going to start with the poor and we're going to expand from there, which is, I think, the most commonly thought way of implementing basic income. But what if we thought about this, for instance, starting as a conservation income, which is an idea from Fletcher and Bucher, who developed this idea of convivial conservation. So what if we gave an unconditional basic income to people in areas critically affected by biodiversity loss? That we know biodiversity loss and the precarization of the people that live in those lands go hand in hand. The more precarious and threatened they are, the more biodiversity suffers. So taking care of people and taking care of the land is literally the same project. And this idea of unconditionality in giving this basic income could replace current means-tested policies of conservation like RED and RED Plus, that I'm sure you are familiar with, that share the same problems of means-tested social policy, so often pointed out by basic income advocates, right? So we know why these means-tested bureaucratic structures have like these vicious logics that reproduce. And on a different line, I'm referring also now a bit more to the cultural dimensions of basic income and degrowth. I also want to suggest that sacrificial logics and forms of compensatory consumerism, that I think it's an important concept, go hand in hand. This question is important for addressing our ecological emergency. I suggest, and then we can also talk more about what anthropology does for this point that I'm making now, that we consume the way we do because we don't get to have a life. Indeed, a lot of our most destructive forms of consumption are precisely because we just don't have time to live the way we would like to. So this is something I've experienced mostly living in London, but so, we pay people to walk our dogs, we order fast food on our apps because we can cook for ourselves, we can look after ourselves, or we fly to remote places so we can feel that we can actually disconnect from our everyday reality that is so attached to work. And all of this plays a significant role, not just in our buying patterns, which is important in itself, but also in our mental life, in the way we think about ourselves and our aspirations and goals in life. I think these forms of compensatory consumerism make us see ourselves through the eyes of capital, which is, it's a terrifying thing in itself. So we invest in ourselves, we see as we pay ourselves with consumption because we work so hard, and all these things really shape ourselves and therefore our sociality, our social life. So in to embrace an anti-sacrificial logic through the freedom to say no, as I started this section with, is to reclaim our lives for ourselves. Our growth-oriented economy makes us human capital for the benefit of GDP growth. And our social policies often make echo of this overarching approach. And I think this is why, and this might be a controversial point, this is why basic income does not fit, I suggest, in its more radical and emancipatory variety, does not fit a pro-growth agenda. And what would be more appropriate if we want to make the economy grow would be this form of micromanaging investment, where we invest in people and we give money to people where it's more convenient and it's going to yield more in terms of human capital, right? So we see this blending, this weird blending of, for instance, in Latin America, we are going to give money to mothers to take care of their children because then the children 20 years down the road are going to be better human capital, so the economy will grow. So we transform the outcome and we transform the beneficial element of that care into a contribution to GDP growth. And I think this can be a double-edged sword, and it can easily backfire. For instance, in this case, as is widely researched in Latin America, like how it turned women into tools of care in a very exploitative way, in a way that it increments their burden, the bureaucratic burden, for instance, to show that they care in the appropriate way. So I think this is something to keep in mind. And again, this point goes back to the wider question of work, which I think is crucial to basic income. And the point I'm making and my approach, I think, has affinity in particular with the more anti-work sources and traditions that support basic income, that we need to question and we need to exit these work-centered societies. And again, drawing from anthropology, this idea that I often hear in debates that it is, there is like a human disposition to productivism or a human disposition to labor that has some form of primacy. It's not so, it's not natural. It's not natural in the sense that it is inevitably the only or the higher way in which people understand their relevance or can become good people in society. And here in this critique to productivism, the growth supports the perspective and the expansion of other forms of human potentiality and cooperation. So we don't see that the only way of using our social creative agency is this narrow, very specific understanding of labor and work. And I think this is important because as long as we, or whoever, I want to put a quote here in the we, or whoever thinks of themselves as Western, maybe some of you do, some of you don't, I don't think I do, but as long as we might see our current civilization as trapped, I mean, we see our current civilization as trapped in the morality of work, and I would agree with that, we can extrapolate that feeling of enchantment into a universal human nature. So we need to avoid the crucial mistake of reducing all forms of creative energies, creative human energies into labor. And here again, look into comparative ethnography, look into archaeology, to understand how other fellow human beings live can be very helpful to expand our political imagination out of this narrow understanding of a natural disposition to be productive. Okay, it's going to be my last point. And I just want to talk a bit, since you are there and I'm here with you now together, to talk also about how we make this happen and how we move this forward and how we build solidarity. I want to talk a bit about this, about building solidarity beyond borders, and how we can think productively of distinctions between different countries and between global north and global south, which is a question that I often get, how relevant these concepts are for both global north and global south. So putting basic income and degrowth together benefits also from acknowledging that relations of dependence in our fossil-based growth-oriented economies are both transnational and also uneven inside national borders. So we need to move beyond these just national distinctions. Our system exploits the majorities in the north, in the global north, as well as those in the south. I'm sure you will be aware of this, but it's incredible how little how often this gets forgotten when we think about this distinction, this political distinction. And I think here I want to briefly present that how we can learn from the discourses that circulate hegemonically at the global level, and how a different political perspective can give us more strength in our analysis. So first, let's talk a bit about the false promises that both poverty and climate change share. I'm going to explain why they are in quotes. So here again, I see a parallel in the need to, I would say, I would make a call of us to oppose false solutions that are being given both to the problem of global poverty and of climate change that have gained currency. So mainstream understandings of poverty and material deprivation have objectified the poor, quote unquote, in their failure to integrate productively in the global economy. So we seem to give the guilt to the people that hasn't managed to find a way of making a living in the globalized economy. And this has made, as I said in the last point, impoverished people the target of exploitation in the name of their own good. This is in current mainstream's term to be understood to be good for the economy, even if you are exploiting people and paying them much less than you would if they were people from other countries, for instance. This is seen like, no, but this is good because you're making the economy grow, and this is, the only way of improving the livelihood of these people. But this promise of development in Latin America, we talk a lot about the promise of the right to development in the near future, and the benefits it should bring to those being included has failed to be fulfilled over and over again. This has marked the history of Latin America. And even when some material progress is achieved, and I would never deny that it is true that some people have experienced a significant material progress or material improvement in some senses, it has often, in the majority of the cases, been at the expense of ecological destruction, sometimes in other corners of the world, or into the future, or sometimes in our own ignored backyards that we have to fight really hard to ignore because they're right there, and it's like really bad situations in the places that have been destroyed. And I think basic income advocates will recognize that this approach to poverty that we see as paternalistic has little in common with the radical unconditionality of basic income. This narrow approach of measuring impact and asserting deservingness of recipients of monetary transfers misses the larger point often made in basic income literature, that there is no system efficient and lean enough to avoid the traps of bureaucracy. Reality is always going to be more complex, and there are some things that conditionality just can't simply get right, and unfairness is going to happen, and the stigma is going to be reproduced, and subjectivities are going to be reproduced if you insist in this idea of of targeting. And on the other hand, a similar thing is happening in mainstream understandings of our ecological breakdown and civilizational crisis by framing it as simply climate change. That is, as a matter of emissions accounting and emissions reduction. It is, again, if you can see the parallel, a bureaucratization of the problem. I'm just going to make an accounting, and I'm going to see how much I'm putting out there and how much I can take, and I'm going to make this get to net zero as it's gained currency lately. I mean, greenhouse gas emissions are important, of course. I'm not going to downplay that. But we need, again, and this is in a similar movement than basic income does, we need to step back from this particular part of the problem and see the wider web of ecological destruction and dispossession, of which global warming is just one dimension. And for exploited people in the global south, it's just the final chapter of a very long book of capitalist exploitation. So focusing only on cutting emissions can take us and our governments to embrace false solutions, like as I said, in recent net zero targets that are being built in legitimizing and perpetuating fossil fuel extraction through this idea of carbon capture or negative emission technologies more widely, many of them that are completely speculative and wishful thinking, acknowledged by supporters themselves. I'm not making any unfounded accusation. And here we need to ask, what is the point of transforming out of fossil fuels if on our way out, we will continue pushing the frontiers of extraction that have destroyed so many lands? What if we need to exploit and occupy the land of the same people we have been exploiting now to put negative emissions technologies or to put fields and fields, ended fields of solar panels or wind farms, for instance? This is happening notoriously, and it's happening already, with the implementation of renewable energies as a panacea that does not need to be nuanced in how we deploy it, in a mindless replacement of fossil fuels that does not question the corporate model of energy provision, which is the one we have now. So we're just focusing on sustaining that model, and we see that model as the only viable model to provide ourselves with energy, for instance. And this takes me to my next point of the need to acknowledge the exploitation of the majorities worldwide. We need to dare to attack the myth that all we need is to go back to some golden age of capitalism or state-led capitalism that relies on precarization. The apparent period of security and stability for some people during the 20th century also depended on extraction and the transformation of landscapes into sacrifice zones, even though we didn't take that into account very often at the moment, with the displacement of communities and the promise of jobs as compromise. And jobs and the employment relation is at the heart of the welfare state, of the European welfare state. And here we need to understand and consider internal colonialism as a modular form of power, as a modular form that has happened here, and I mean here in Europe, and in other places of the global south, as where I come from. And this commonality, I think, of understanding this more than our differences, our commonalities, can help us understand common ground in advocating for basic income. It makes sense from that perspective to the majorities being exploited everywhere in different countries. Doesn't matter the overall figure of your national economy, there is a lived experience that is shared beyond that. Finally, degrowth and basic income share the challenge of transforming money and structures of debt. And this is, again, a conversation I don't think we can skip when we talk about basic income and degrowth together in particular. This will be inescapable to see how we can make economically viable both horizons. Our monetary designs today are just not fit for purpose. They're fit for a very particular purpose, which is enriching the people that are already rich, and that is doing really well. But we could think definitely of different monetary systems. We could think about dual monetary systems, debt abolition, ecological reparations, etc. And on that note, I just wanted to briefly mention these two initiatives that I think, as I started by saying, are bringing together these from places in the global south and are making a very similar convergence of arguments in their own terms. So the first example, which is the image you see on the left, the Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, which could be translated to English as Eco-Social Pact from the South, was released around the same time in 2020 when we were all talking about these manifestos to build back better and Green New Deals and all these things that we thought would be possible. In Latin America, we were also having that sort of conversations. And really interestingly, if you're interested, you can check the manifesto online in English as well. In its diagnosis, basic income was one of the key demands and is one of the key demands. This pact is still going and still trying to gather support. Which is interesting for me because in Latin America now there is a still marginal but growing reconsideration of how to break from this commodities consensus, which is a concept explored by sociologist Maristela Svampa, Argentinian sociologist, in which resource exploitation is justified through redistributive policies from the state. And again, the welfare state cannot sustain itself in such mechanisms anymore. Economist Rubén Lobolo have also talked about this, about how our Latin American horizon of a welfare state cannot continue relying on that mechanism, even though we never managed to have a welfare state to begin with. Like, that doesn't change the fact. And yeah, so this pact made a call to action with concrete policies, like something like 10 of them. One of them was basic income. And this has been done in close collaboration with environmental justice movements across the continent. And yeah, and also very importantly, in 2021, if you know the Economic Commissions for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEPAL for the name in Spanish, suggested the implementation in stages of a basic income in Latin America, which I think it's super interesting considering the relevance this body has. It was ignored by governments, of course, but the fact that it was made as an official policy suggestion, I think is very telling. And of course, as you also might have heard in other places, there are interesting advances on implementing basic income in the city of Marica in Brazil and for the elderly in Ciudad de Mexico. And finally, I just wanted to mention what you see on the right, which is the Deuda por el Clima, which is an emergent platform that is bringing together social environmental movements, that it's pointing out that restructuring debt relations for addressing climate change, making global north countries responsible for the damage that they have inflicted and continue to inflict in global south countries, simply by legitimizing unfair systems of debt. So, you know, if we just continue upholding the current systems of debt, that's already a huge act of environmental injustice. And we need to recognize ecological debt, for instance. And this is also, I think, an interesting thing, like to put together with basic income, like how do we make a basic income compatible with a call to climate reparations, for instance? Like, I think there is a conversation there that needs to happen that I don't have the answer. I'm just bringing the questions, but yeah. So with that, I think I've spoken long enough. So thank you. And I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you a lot for this presentation, Gabriela. I would just go directly to the questions till we have the spirit. First, yeah, I'm asking the present public to put their questions on. We have mic for you, so who would like to start? Okay, Vitma Sarah. Andra, could you take mic from Antonis? Andra, you have to put it on. Yes.
I was quite touched by the notion of the, let's say, conservationist income for some endangered, let's say, communities or areas. And I wanted to ask you whether you could develop a bit about perhaps an existing debate about post-conflict reconstruction in consideration with the unconditional basic income because now currently in Europe there's huge debate about Ukraine and what's going on there now in these current months, and with big question marks about what's going to be happening there in the coming years. There are huge financial transfers being done from whatever possible directions, and the issue of just distribution somewhere where the communities are very endangered and have currently completely damaged environment is very, let's say, current. So if you have any comments upon this.
Are we collecting more, or should I answer?
I guess it will be much better to answer one by one.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, I didn't get your name.
It's Vitek Masare, and he is part of this green political party here, like one of the leading politicians from the party.
Great. Yes, thanks. Sorry, but please, if you introduce yourself, it's better for me to give you an answer. I think I don't have that much to add. I think you made a connection that is really interesting. And I mean, I can share with you this proposal that comes from their, as I said, their overall approach to convivial conservation. And we did a really, really interesting talk talking about how convivial conservation can talk to degrowth a couple of years ago in the context of the pandemic with one of the authors of this proposal. And I can share that with you. And I think what you say, it's really correct, like in I mean, conflict and zones in which biodiversity is being destroyed are conflict zones. Like, it's just a matter of seeing how militarized, for instance, the Amazon has become. I mean, it's a war zone over the destruction of the forest for the cattle industry. So yes, absolutely. Like it is an instrument of peace, and I'm sure it will speak to the reality now of Ukraine and whatever ends up happening there in the period of reconstruction. So certainly, like yeah, I didn't highlight that, but absolutely, you can see it as a solution and as a way out of conflict in that matter. So thank you for bringing that.
Was it a sufficient answer? Okay, great. Can we move to another question from public, which is presented here? Anyone would like to react or to add any? Okay, great. You're getting mic.
Sorry.
Adrienne Göhler speaking.
Hi, I'm coming from Berlin, and I'm an activist and maybe also a little theoretical approach person of the basic income. And of course, I am in a conflict because I'm very much sticking to the idea of the unconditional basic income, which is, of course, in a country like in Germany, people freak out because, you know, they try to overcome the trauma of two world wars by work. And work for them, of course, was paid work or male work. So the unconditional idea is very important to me. But I am more and more, I think, being based in Berlin, having a countryside around where people are going, they leave the country because there is no possibility to make their life. So I try to combine the two ideas, how to have, and the conservation idea is very, very interesting. But still I have, of course, the problem, who is defining what you can consider as to conserve something or to reculturize or to go back to a culture we left for capitalism or we left for maximization of profit. And if I think about Ukraine, I'm very much, of course, concerned, and I said, we need to have a basic income, but of course it would not be unconditional. because it would be linked to have another idea of building, of constructing, of architecture, of living together, of housing. So a lot of criteria, and none of them is unconditional. So I share the big question I have with you.
Hi, Adriana. Thanks for that. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think this element of my talk is also the result of a couple of years of talking about this with my comrades in the Latin American network. That, you know, I'm like you, like I really think the most powerful element of basic income is the unconditionality. Like, you know, I often hear like, oh, but what if we exclude the 10% richest and all these things? And I'm like, no, it has to be unconditional. You know, like, I absolutely think this is, if you don't go all the way, it doesn't work, because you really need to reshape the whole thing and the whole sense of a social contract, if you want to call it like that. And I agree with you on that. And I think my interest in this income, in this conservation income, that it puts in dialogue these two literatures of conservation concerns and cash transfers and basic income in particular, is that it's an interesting way out of implementing that it's focused on socioeconomical, like monetary criteria that I think are much easier to get stuck. So I think that the most powerful effects of basic income, and maybe the ones we still haven't seen that much, are when a full city or a full region, a full village, as we have seen, receive it. Because only then you see like how the overall, the unmeasurable impacts happen. And here I really like how the examples in like the trials in India show this, you know, like how the societal aspect changes. And very often we see these trials in, like, you know, they measure how much a person changed their circumstance, and they don't focus on the relational or the ecological, much less. So this way of either trialing or implementing it, like, okay, we're not going to start basic income for everyone tomorrow. All the proposals I have seen, including the ones in Chile, present, you know, like a stepped implementation. I believe that one that would harness the benefits of basic income and would gather more support in the way it's implemented and more legitimization would be something like a conservation income. And I think here we can learn very much from the implementation of Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which was thought as a first step towards a basic income, but it targeted the poor. So what happens there, and I have seen this in other places, is that once you reach a certain threshold, it gets stuck there. It's really hard to transform a social policy presented as a poverty alleviation measure into a human right. That step is really hard to make. And I think that if you start by places that have been, you know, the sacrifice zones, and then you start like widening the circles, like geographically, we could say, I think that would allow us to see a completely different potential of basic income. And I'm betting, this is of course my own political conviction, I don't know, that it would gather more support, and it would really help pushing the boundaries and make us move towards basic income. So yeah, but I agree. I also have this tension. Like, I don't think there is no way of doing it without avoiding these political dangers of co-option and of limitation. But thanks.
Yeah, thank you a lot. I would just like to add that the first more complex pilot programs are finally creeping in, finding their way. If you have like the opportunity, maybe tonight, you can speak, for example, about this Spanish or precisely Catalonian project that is starting in the end of this year, hopefully. And the basic parameter is to get basic income, which is also like a very uncompromised criteria that it has to be basic. Of like 1,000 euro to 5,000 people living like in one neighborhood. So just a little reminder that things are maybe moving. And now I would like to give word to Angelina Cusi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabi, for the lecture and congratulations, of course. I think that the power of this kind of events and also of something what many of us represent is in the fact that we link theories with political strategical thinking, right? We don't like to talk only about the theories without the practice, and we don't like the practice which is theoretically blind. And your lecture was, of course, on the theoretical level, very brilliant. But we know also that you are an activist, and that you are an activist in Chile, which is right now very inspiring place, and you are very in the middle of many different processes related to sustainable future, I mean the growth future, or radically anti-productivist future, and also the universal basic income. So I wanted to ask you, whatever comes to your mind about the strategies, like not only, you know, like wide, broad, big ideas, but any tiny, small, everyday action that you guys do there and that you think that are important to promote the universal basic income in the framework of the growth, whatever comes to your mind. Thank you.
Right, thanks for this input.
Well, Angie, that's like the hardest question, but it's an interesting one. Like I know what you mean, and then this, you know, I think about this day and night, and maybe I can share two insights. One of a lesson we learned now in the constitutional process, a lesson of failure, I have to admit, and the other one that is more hopeful, that comes from the environmental movement side. So as I said, our basic income network started in 2020 in the context of the pandemic, but also in the context, most of you probably don't know this, but in the context of the drafting of a new constitution. So we thought this is the best moment with the pandemic, of course, to make clear that something as a universal basic income is fundamental, and it is an emerging human right, and we need to push this, and we need to have this in the new constitution. And we managed to talk to some of the representatives, and we managed to convince a few of them to have an initial set of articles that would guarantee, we call it like vital minimum, mínimo vital in Spanish, guaranteed as a basic income. And you know, when we talked to many of them, for them it was like, yes, this is great, I completely understand, or many of them knew about the idea and were very open and supportive of it. So we managed to put it in a first floor of debate, but sadly, in the moment in which the articles were moving from the commissions to the plenary, we didn't have the political momentum and the political muscle to make this a priority. And you know, it didn't get to the negotiations needed to make this, it didn't make the vote in the plenary, which was a shame, and show us that, yes, as Angie said, like it's not enough to be like, you know, a group of academic activists or politically engaged people that are convinced just with each other, and we really need to extend the conversation. And for instance, I really see as a challenge of our network to extend the conversation to unions, for instance, that we didn't manage to talk to that much, or with feminist collectives. Because at the same time that we were advocating for basic income, this idea of a recognition of unpaid domestic work was also being pushed. And I believe that it made it to the final draft, if I'm not wrong. So, you know, these things, even if they're not incompatible in reality, if we could say so, they compete for political attention and organizing. So it was really hard for us to engage in conversations with these collectives in that context. So that's one learning. But the other one is that environmental justice movements and collectives really managed to make a lot of changes in the constitution. And that was basically just by connecting the different struggles. So many of the people that were elected, I would say something about 20-25% of 155 of those elected, which is a lot, were leaders, most of them women, directly involved in local struggles, you know, against hydroelectric dams, against coal power plants, against mining, very notably against water scarcity, and you know, the whole conflict with avocado production on water, etc. And the knowledge that the connection that these different, you know, cells of damage had created by working together throughout the years really came to fruition in this writing of these articles that, you know, acknowledge the rights of nature and acknowledge, you know, we don't talk about natural resources, we talk about bienes comunes naturales, like natural common goods, I guess is the translation. And, you know, all this like epistemic pool was there. And when the opportunity opened, it was ready to go. It was ready to go. We already had the learnings and we had the reports that, you know, measured the pollution and how much less children, you know, live, like how much more sick they get for living in these areas. And we had that documented and ready to go. And I think that's the main lesson for me, that you never know when a revolutionary moment could happen. Like before October 2019, when all happened, we had no idea we would have a constituent process, but we had all these proposals already ongoing, all these studies, all these conversations were brewing. So, you know, what you are weaving in different collectives might be called and be needed in unexpected moments. So it's always good to keep that building up, even if you don't see now the political window when that will happen. Like we won't know how the revolution will happen. That's like a given. If we knew, I mean, it wouldn't be the revolution we need, right? So that's, I think, like my main learning, like to keep that collaboration and production of consensus and proposals and concepts going at all times.
Perfect, thank you. There is another question yet from the presented public. It's Andrzej Koliński going to ask, and then for a brief moment we will try to focus on also our online public and the questions they were already written. So I will ask Antonis maybe to prepare some. And now the question of yours.
Yes, thank you. My question is a little bit similar to the last one, and I'm going to ask about the top-down versus bottom-up elements in the policy, because in your keynote, I heard a lot of the top-down focus. I understand the societal implications. I understand even the policy relationship with, like you mentioned, Central or Latin American countries being recommended to actually implement it at the central level. So my question is there any entry points for bottom-up solutions before it is implemented? So do we need to have conversations that you mentioned with unions or with activists or with other groups about the shape of the policy, or is it more about trying to push the policy through and get it there to exist, and only then seeing what it will create in the bottom-up manner after it is implemented?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's also a very important and difficult question. I mean, I think here we have differences. I'm thinking of the people I work with and I talk to in the different networks I participate in. And for instance, now recently we're having this conversation of, should we put for a trial and implementing a trial in one municipality in Chile, you know, very much in the line of what's happening in Catalonia now. And for some people, it was like, this is a bad idea, you know, like this is not, this won't give us any political gain. Like we should go for first getting it in the constitution or something like that, or we're getting like a statewide thing first and then seeing how we implement it. Some of us, like I count myself in this side, I see more that the way into doing this is more bottom up. So implementing it at a city level or at a, you know, town level, whatever, like even if it's, you know, not using money, state issued money, but maybe alternative currencies. I think like this is the more interstitial way in which we can do it. I hardly see that the state at the central level will approve this. I think it just it's very counterintuitive for the principles that sustain states, I believe. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope that one state will surprise me and do it, but so far it seems really difficult. And that's why I mentioned, and maybe these are examples I can share material with you if you want, that the city of Maricá in Brazil, for me, it's crucial because it's a city that proposed to have a basic income and is moving toward the basic income and has been issued. It's not universal, but still it's a basic income, and it's a very, you know, significant policy that has revitalized local economy in a city. It's a city near Rio de Janeiro. And of course, this has its own challenges. For instance, the money that it's used for the policy, it comes from the oil of the city. So it's like, well, how can we do it so that it doesn't depend that it's economically sustainable without that, right? Like, you know, this is offering us already the key questions that we need to address. And I think in that example in particular, there is a lot to learn from. And I hope in the near future, more cities will jump on board with projects like this that are very ambitious. But I think, yeah, for me, at least personally, I think that's the way to strategize.
Thank you. I would maybe direct your attention to yesterday's speech we had by Helena Norberg-Hodge. She's settled now in Australia, and she's leading her company Local Futures. And this is exactly like for years and decades, like a project which is developing and propagating these like bottom-up policies. And also then we have Tomáš Heisler here, and who is like one of the prominent Czech people trying hardly like to push these bottom-up developments. So I hope you will then enjoy conversation with him. And yet, before we go for online public, we have also a question or commentary by Magdalena Davis, who is the co-leader of Czech Green Party, and she is also a mayor of a small middle Bohemian town.
Hi, Gabriela. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. It was very good for me to hear about your work, what you're doing. And one of my question is, and I think maybe probably not just mine, but everybody else's, is about the complexity of application of the universal basic income, not only in terms of contrast between the countries of the global south and global north, but also in terms of distinguishing the different social systems of different countries. Because, for example, USA is not a country of global south, and at the same time, it has very poor social security system. And therefore, the universal basic income there would have vastly different consequences to some of the highly social-oriented countries in Europe. And because we're here as part of the European community, I was really interested in your opinions on the different impacts on these different systems, especially because you have the experience with the Chilean application, but also obviously with some European ones. So I would very appreciate if you could point out some of the similarities and some of the vast differences that we should be ready for. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, great question. And this is also something, I'm sure this point has been addressed in the conference before. I have some friends, and when they hear about basic income, they say, it sounds great, but I really fear it's going to be used as a tool for stopping us from reaching, so the provision of social rights. That's how we say it in Spanish. I'm not sure. Derechos sociales, I guess. Like, because in Chile, famously neoliberal, everything you can imagine is highly privatized. Until very little ago, we didn't even have a retirement system. It was like a forced savings system that we had. And I understand. And every time I hear these concerns, I'm like, yes, it is very possible to give basic income with one hand and taking or stopping advancement of social rights with the other. And I think that is a real political problem that we need to address. And I think that here the key principle to keep in mind that for me is useful to think about this is that basic income, to be emancipatory as we want it, has to increase the realm of unconditionality in our relationship with each other. I think that if we take that as a criteria, then we know if we're doing it and implementing it in the right way, or if we are actually damaging people in the process. And this relates both with like social services existing and to be constructed and to be claimed, as in the case of Chile, and I would say the United States as well. I agree with you. And also when we think about how to pay for it, because I also hear like, well, if you paid with the VAT, which is the most unequal form of tax, then I wouldn't support it. Like if you offer me to implement a basic income based on that, for me that's an unfair way of supporting it. And this goes again to the same principle of how you really need to redesign the whole structure And definitely the question, like for me, I learn so much when I see proposals for basic income, for instance, for Germany, I have seen a couple, or for other European countries, that when I see in the numbers, in the details, how much money goes for taxes, how much money people already access in different services, I'm like, I don't know how to relate this to my reality, because in Chile it's absolutely different, you know, and then, and this is, I think you're pointing at something important, that to have a conversation in this, between these two different contexts, the knowledge that we need to understand systems like the Chilean is very different. Like, I wouldn't know how to translate a proposal for Germany for Chile. And one of the challenges that we have now in the Chilean basic income network is that we want to create like a mock budget for basic income and to show that it can be afforded. That it is affordable, and there is already one proposal for that, and it includes precisely what you say, precisely like how this is complementary, for instance, with expanding the public sector and finishing the private one, that it's, you know, used by the wealthy minority, etc., etc. And I do think there is a language of policy that is still needs to be built, so we can have this nationwide conversation. So yeah, looking forward that we work on that. Thanks.
Well, now ask if there is any urgent question from public here. Half urgent. Okay, you can give space to this one.
Not even a question, a comment. I hate people commenting instead of asking, but I need to do that now, and I'm sure that Gabby will agree. I wanted to draw on what you said, that we never know when the momentum's gonna be. We never know where the open window will appear, and taking into account where some discussions from this event brought us to two questions. How do we finance the universal basic income, and why it must be unconditional? I think, I'm sorry, maybe it's going to be a little bit rude, but I really believe that we should stop making these questions, because when like we must be ready when the moment will come, and it came with the pandemic. Of course, we already lost one opportunity. Like, we must be ready to not let people in general, whoever it is, ourselves even, to bring us back to those questions. Like, it's like, okay, if you want to know how to finance it, then you have the information here and there, or briefly explain it. Or if you want to know why it must be unconditional, well, I think that in Spain it's they do it in a very good way, that they do not let people to talk about the basic income when they talk about something which is conditional. It's because it's like for this, coming back to the topic of the strategy, language is very important. We know that, right? So this is like making it faster and shorter to not get engaged in this kind of discussions, that the universal basic income is the universal basic income, and the definition is this and that, and it must be unconditional. Otherwise, it's not a basic income. So that's this idea, and one I don't know, idea from our context in Barcelona as activists of Barcelona en Comú, and our creative communication people. We did like a poster when we explain like with, I don't know, like very beautiful drawings, what is the universal basic income, for what, blah, blah, blah. And we just put it in the city, for like people who don't know what it is or never have heard about it. And I think that this intervention in the city is also very important, and graphics and simple language, but do not always having in mind that we can't, if the momentum comes, or like in our daily life, our activism even, we can't just always come back to the questions, why unconditional, and how to fund it.
Great. I guess also Gabi would probably agree, if you want to add something to that.
I don't know if there's no other question in the room, because I don't see.
We will definitely have to give space to those online participants, but
Yeah, I'm just being mindful of the time. I mean, I agree.
Commentaries on this.
Or is there something else? No?
Yeah, we were still asking.
Okay. No, I mean,
Oh.
just a very brief comment that I think it's what you're saying, Angelina, is very right. And I think it was very telling for me when I first started talking publicly about basic income in 2020. I think it took me like a year, because at the beginning I would say, oh no, universal basic income. And people would say, oh yeah, great, sounds great. Like I support that idea. And I was like, why are people so easily saying yes? And then with the months, I understood that people were listening to me superficially, because we have so many policies that are labeled universal when they're not, when they consider only, you know, the 80% of the poor that is registered in the National Registry, blah, blah, blah. Then they thought that when I meant universal, I meant the people that are usually targeted for social policy, you know. And then when I said, no, but it's everyone, it's like, well, what do you mean everyone? So yeah, like it's literally, you know, it's not the distorted meaning of universal that has become commonplace. And that was like very unsettling, because it was like, but like nothing is universal, you know, like it's a you know, it's a very provocative language. And I think that says a lot about who the clients of the state or the patients of the state are. And there is a comrade in the Latin American network that always says, like, you know, policies for the poor are poor policies. And, you know, as long as we keep framing the conversation of basic income as part of that family, then that word will never gain its more radical meaning. So it's always like, you know, this effort of like taking that epistemic load from it and moving it more to like, you know, human rights and whatever else we want to take it. I think it's a constant challenge, and there's no other way than just like every time we talk about it, make this case, you know, make this point and insist on it. It's the only way. And I haven't, if anyone knows a new one, you can tell me.
Great. I would still support like the people who speak Czech, maybe, who would like to ask, to make any comment. Don't be shy. It's so interesting topic. There must be so many questions among you. Oh, great. I sometimes can be insistent.
Hello.
Do we have the way? You speak English, okay.
A bit.
Perfect.
Hopefully I will make it. Hello, my name is Jiří Pokorný. I'm a student of anthropology at university. So I would like to ask you a brief question about what anthropological research is needed right now. Because I'm still a student, so I'm curious, you know, about it. Yeah, what anthropology can, as discipline, can contribute to the debate, and so.
Yes, please give this guy the job.
Well, again, I mean, these are like very gifts of questions. There is so much research we need. I mean, it's in this intersection, there's always, for me, the most provocative literature in anthropology is the one that comes to show how much we have in common with people that we think are very different from us. And very often people that, for instance, in the past, we tend to think that at some moment, you know, something like modernity happened and we don't share anything with people that lived before that moment. And I see this very deterministic thinking and very evolutionist linear thinking, you know, very 19th century, that is very pervasive even today. A very conservative approach that I think anthropology can break from inside, both in archaeology and in comparative contemporary ethnography, showing that so many of the things we take for granted are not so. And so many of the questions, you know, I often get this, I'm talking about degrowth, like this issue of scale, you know, like, oh yes, you know, these affluent societies were like small tribes scattered in the savannah. And, you know, if we want to live any other way that is not like this, then we need growth, we need industry, we need centralized matrix of gas, and anything that comes after will have to build on that and has to resemble this very particular configuration of a civilization, really, that we were born in, but many generations from our ancestors lived differently. So, and I think anthropology really shows and frames this in a longer epistemic space in which our high energy modernity is just one moment that we can say in many senses a deviant moment in which you know, we got used to this idea of like endless, cheap, abundant fuel and the invisibilization of exploitation worldwide. And that the only way forward, you know, like anything that unties those structures is going to be like an involution of society and of culture, which I think it's very, you know, it's a fear that many people have, like that we need to give up on things, and anthropology really can help us like widen our imagination and our creativity. So, you know, be it in the study of history or in the ethnographic understanding of contemporary people that live differently and find joy in a different form, that find that sustain their livelihoods in other notions that are not scarcity and productivism, but for instance, abundance and other notions of productiveness that have to do with plenitude and relatedness with the land. Then I mean, I could go on all full-on anthropologists here, and we could talk about those principles, right, that are really powerful, that can help us today, and they have the same political currency that when what we relate with modernity, you know, that we for some reason isolate from conversation with these other concepts. That I think is a crucial mistake. So that, broadly speaking, would be like what we should do more of.
You want to react? If you want to react? No, okay. So it was satisfied. Any still unsatisfied questions? Or urgent commentaries or unurgent commentaries or observations? Of course, I don't want to extract everything right now because we have still the big debate in front of us. But Antonis, do we have some comments in the chat? I've seen some while Gabi was speaking. Nothing interesting, nothing important. Okay. Yeah, I embarrassed you right now. Oh, great.
I dare, because the word universal is really complicated, I feel. And I want to know, why don't you talk about the unconditioned basic income? Because then people say, huh? What? What do you mean? And I give one point extra, because that is very complicated. In Germany, you have, the German is income. And I now tend more and more to the word outcome, which is not, you cannot translate it word by word. It's, I had like 20 interpreters who tried to find what is the right word in English, and it's livelihood. So, because then we start to talk about a human right. In my capitalist country, people say, income, but what for? What are you doing? What are you delivering? And I say, well, it is, you know, it is the basic need. And then you start to really have a complicated conversation. And the moment you start to say this is a human right, and we have, all people have the same right, because nobody has been asked ever if the person wants to be on Earth. So now we start to have the moment a person is on Earth, we start to have, as a community, the obligation to help. This is his or her right. And if we now bring it together with the 17 sustainability goals, but the first goal is no poverty. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, how should that be possible without a basic income, which, again, I consider more and more. I'm part of the universal, or of the unconditioned basic in Earth network, but still, I think we should slowly bring it into the direction of livelihood, because then we talk more on your constitution. Then we talk about constitutional right, and less about income. So you get an income for nothing to do. This is, and it is very interesting, because I had a bunch of like philosophers around who said, okay, now as you bring the subject on the plate, can you understand me?
Yes, Sorry, I'm just hearing like a noise, like a music.
No music?
Now it's gone. Sorry, I was listening like a ringtone.
Okay.
Never mind. But yes, I got the question. Sorry, do you want to say something else?
Service, I'm sure. So more and more people started to say, now, as you say it, I feel very uncomfortable with the word income because it is super linked to the traditional thinking. So I wonder if you have an idea on that, or if I can just hand it over to you.
Okay, yes, thanks, Adriana. I feel like I could talk about this for hours with you because it's so interesting, like the different, this is like a house that you can enter through different entrances and through the roof or the window or the door. And I think only recently I have made that same insight of the relevance of emphasizing unconditionality rather than universality. And I think that this is maybe my Latin American bias and maybe like my own political history, in which so much of the struggle of human rights and for social rights has been under the banner of universality rather than unconditionality. So for instance, the whole fight for free higher education that was really important for me in 2011, the key word for gratuity for free was a universal free education. So, the word unconditionality didn't really reflect what we were aiming for. So I think that for us, the idea of universality is more at hand, but you're right, it doesn't mean the same. And I do think unconditionality is more challenging because sometimes you can fall in this conditional cash transfer logic that you say, well, yes, we're going to give it to everyone, but then, and this is something I hear more often than I would like, people need to somehow check in back. So they need to prove that they're caring for people because, if they want to do unpaid work, then they have to prove they're working, or they have to prove they're volunteering, or they have to prove any form of improvement that, it's the value for money that you're getting. You need to measure that and you need to capture that value. And I think this is an incredibly toxic way of seeing it. You're undermining the radical potential of basic income. And I think here it really goes back to of changing the meaning of money. I mean, I can't see it any other way. I believe if basic income is implemented, the meaning of money will change. Like, if we design it or not, because if you are attaching that to people's existence, then the value that is reflecting cannot be boiled down again to this productive value that is supposed to be represented in money. So I think that's why it really touches you in like a very intimate fiber, even for people that see themselves as very progressive. Like this really scares their value principles, like their cosmological principles, I would say. So I completely agree with you that it could be more, I will try to now include always unconditionality in every time I talk about this, in my advocacy, because I agree that this is a road that we need to push much more.
Now I even myself feel urged like to add something, because this is really like one of the most brilliant topics to bring up. And this is also that, like, when we talk about human rights, we are learned to think slow, like to think low about that, like it's cut it in our minds, like what human rights, like what it means. Usually when we talk about basic income and human rights, it is okay, we have human right to live, to survive, to have something to eat, maybe not even good quality for nothing, and maybe some safe place, and maybe, not freezing to the death. But I guess like lots, we have to speak up a lot about creativity. And when I speak about creativity, okay, we have artists also here present among us, but even artist creativity is deeply connected to science, to development, to its like basic human potential to be creative in any human situation, to come up with diversified solutions for anything, which is again like deeply connected to context, to living locally, to understanding our region, our place, our territory, ourselves, and having time for that. And this is like huge topic, like we should speak about when we speak about society and contribution, that we have to have time to know each other and, build up like what is natural for us once we know. Yeah, just this commentary. If you want to react or anyone else still, we can continue. Yeah. Okay, I would just now give word to Vitmasare again. Thank you.
It's again Vitmasare. I came up to my mind with a question related to different livelihood costs in different, let's say, areas, communities, countries, whatever. And I wanted to ask you whether there is any debate or debate results about how to set the threshold, the amount of the unconditional or universal income, whether it is something that favorizes, let's say, some modest living in the countryside or even more modest living in the urban areas, because the current livelihood costs differ very much. In many places, there is the housing crisis being very, very important as a driver of whatever decision making of common people, and so. So this is my question, and it's related to the fact that I came across an academic study recently that calculated the levels of consumption in order to provide the whole world's population with the basic needs in order to comply with the planetary limitations, and the study stated that, for example, in Europe, the country whose living standards are currently those that meet those standards of, let's say, sustainability is Moldova, which is quite hardly understandable for most people around Europe, that unless we get to the current Moldovan living standards, we are beyond the threshold. And on the other hand, most of the world population is probably like below the Moldovan living standards.
Wow, I mean, again, you're asking me a question that I can't answer in 3 minutes, because this is the topic of a doctoral thesis, most likely. I completely agree with you. This is very tricky. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is like, I believe the amounts should be universal, they should be equal for a given political community. And I think this is very important. There shouldn't be differences inside. So like, I think, like, if you, for instance, in Chile, if you live in a region where accessing energy is extremely expensive, then maybe there should be a subsidy for that. That shouldn't be translated into a basic income. The basic income should be this space of freedom that it's complemented with the provision of public services. So, like it shouldn't play into that, I think. But then what is the size of a political community is very difficult, because the way I think about it, if we start regionally or in small cities, then maybe they can afford in principle and they can work through different thresholds. And then you would have in the same national boundaries different basic incomes, but they would be for different political communities. So, all these things, and maybe in a federal system, it's different. Like maybe a federal system would agree, we don't have one, but would agree to different amounts in different states. So this is absolutely a complicated, politically charged question that I think it's an important one that we keep in mind. And what you say about Moldova and the provision, I mean, the whole issue of livelihoods, again, it's interesting, because as I said in the lecture, the highest, some places that we associate with more sustainable patterns of consumption and systems of provision is basically that they haven't adopted the most toxic, high energy intensive systems that we have adopted. But that doesn't mean that the only way of improving their livelihoods is to get there. Like, to give an example, in transportation, a place that doesn't depend, that their cities doesn't depend on people owning each other a massive car that works with petrol, have a much lower ecological footprint, obviously. But the only way of improving people mobility, the right to mobility, is not to adopt that model that is high material and energy intense. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. Like that is the challenge. The challenge is we don't need to move those indicators up by copying what some people in some places are doing wrong, but actually finding new ways of, for instance, creating system of provisions of transport that are ecologically reasonable. And of course, it's never about transport, it's about how we design our cities, where the food we are eating is coming from, because so much of the oil we use is to move food around. And then again, you have the system expanding. So it's never just about what happens inside the borders, it's about how you're integrating yourself or not to these wider systems that give you what you need and why you need it. You know, like the fact that you need a car to exist in suburban United States, you know, that's a design. It's an explicit design that was designed for being like that. There is nothing about moving around that requires that. There's nothing about having a full life that requires that. It was an explicit and a pathway that it was decided in the United States. So all these things have to be put together. Yeah, but great question again. I can't make justice to it in this short space. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. We still have one more question from public. I can introduce Anna Shabatova, who is, among others, our former ombudsman. So she's deeply connected with human rights. Please go.
Děkuji. Thank you. My name is Anna Shabatova and I will speak in Czech. I have been thinking a lot alongside of working about universal unconditional basic income. I've been thinking about it for about 10 years since when I first heard about it. I have always focused more on practical aspects of things. I've always worked actively in the social services area or social work area. And I feel that every major change causes some bigger changes or reflections in society. So that is something we should keep in mind when talking about UBI. We should think about how to move step by step. I think the biggest change we need to make, or the biggest shift we need to make, is to move away from the idea of he who does not work shall not eat. We have all grown up in that. We have all accepted it as the norm. It is also the underlying principle of all types of support of people in need. To put it in other words, the Czech constitution guarantees support to everyone in material hardship, but the relevant act stipulates a range of conditions. So the contribution, the financial contribution, is very low and it is tested. It is not unconditional. People need to make an effort. They need to prove that they are trying to find a job. And if we're really talking about universal, fundamental human rights, everybody should have a right to livelihoods, as my colleague here has mentioned. Just because they are here, everybody needs to eat, everybody needs to drink, everybody needs a place to sleep. We should have the possibility to find a place like that. And philosophically speaking, this is the idea that this must be deserved, must be abandoned. We should have the right, not the obligation to deserve this. This is the starting point, in my opinion. This is where we need to start. There is a wide range of unconditional types of income, even though historically they have been conditioned. It's like pensions for retired people. There is a contribution in the Czech Republic. There is a parental allowance that women or their partners get. The person who takes care of the baby gets this contribution up to the baby's 3 years of age. there are ways to either make the contribution higher and have it paid for a shorter period of time, or the other way around. So there are types of income which are unconditioned. We all know that modern states, modern economies in Europe are ecosystems that are globally interconnected. We have seen what happened during the COVID pandemic. Face masks, for example, were not available for a certain period of time. Or in the US, 2 factories producing children's alimentation stopped production, and this type of alimentation was not available. Their operation was stopped because the products were contaminants, so the production stopped, but the food was not available. I'm saying this to show how complex the system we're living in is, and how conditional, how things depend on each other. But as I mentioned, the starting point for me would really be that we have a right to eat, to live, to have something to wear, and to have a place to sleep. That is something that should be a human right. We should not have the obligation to prove that we deserve this amount of money. I consider that reasonable. There is a philosophical dimension to this. I understand, I acknowledge this non-growth or degrowth idea. It is a philosophical dimension, but for me, I think this will take still a lot of time to accept this idea. There's one more thing I would like to say, which is that I did not really understand why we adhere so much to the idea that everybody should get this income, even affluent people who are not doing anything useful, and yet they have a rent, a regular income, they own unimaginable amounts of money, property. And I cannot really see why these people should be receiving some basic income. This is a way to make this whole idea more realistic. So the question is, should there be maybe a threshold, or should there be some limit? People who want to live shouldn't have the obligation to prove that they are looking for a job, that they shouldn't be sanctioned for missing an appointment at an agency. The law is extremely strict in the Czech Republic. In Germany, it will be similar, I suppose, because this "who does not work shall not eat" is a universal idea, I would say.
Thank you for that. Well, the point I tried to make is that he who shall not work shall not eat is not a universal idea. It's actually a very specific, very particular, historically traceable colonial project that was expanded throughout the world through colonial exploitation. In Chile, very particularly, this is my research, this is what I do. It was a Christian colonial project in which people had to be imposed into an ethic of work through violence. And that was the only way of teaching people that they were poor, because they were not poor before the arrival of the colonialists. So like, this is it's not inescapable. Now it seems inescapable to us because we are the product of many centuries of this, but it's certainly not. I'm just going to say 2 more things because I've spoken too much about why give it to the rich. I believe in rehabilitation. I would like also for them to transform their subjectivity out of this system that has shaped them as they are. So I wouldn't exclude them from universal basic income. And again, as I said, I think the universality is important for the sense of solidarity that it builds, because if you receive it, then you have to contribute. And if you don't receive it, then, well, you open the door to say, then why do I have to contribute if I'm not receiving it? That wouldn't be a bad argument, I think. So there are dangers to opening that door, I think, out of unconditionality that for me make me stay with the idea of unconditionality. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say just to close.
Thank you for the brilliant answer. And we have one urgent comment here. Thank you, Magdalena Davis.
Thank you so much to Anna for asking that question and to
Já bych chtěla poděkovat.
feel the urge to respond as well in terms of contributing to the debate about why to give it to everyone. I think there's two key points to me. One is the point of stigmatization. Like every time we divide the society in any way, then the question arises, where do we draw the line? And so who is below and who is above? That's one point. The other point I wanted to make was, and I found that personally very interesting, was the study that was, or it's not even a study, it's just a project that keeps going on in Alaska. And it's the dividend of the royalties from the oil being mined in Alaska that is given to every single citizen of Alaska who lives there. And the outcomes are really interesting because the people who were asked about this dividend, which is not much, it's between $1,000, $2,000 a year. But the people said one fantastic thing about it is that they know it's coming. It's that security of that income that really makes a difference to their lives, and they can calculate on or count on the fact that they will receive it. And the other thing, which I found even more interesting, was the fact that they said everyone has right to it. It's the rich of our land, or these are the riches of our land. And it makes me feel as if I was the stakeholder of this, and I am receiving something that actually makes me feel good, makes me feel that I am an owner of something, or I have the right to something. And I think psychologically, this is a key element. Thank you.
Very great comment. I will just, yeah, of course, I will let you react. Okay, great, then, thank you a lot. Yeah, I like it that we have lots to talk about now, and I would only ask you for being patient with other comments, because as I said, we have a big debate now starting in an hour. We still have to rebuild the setting here, and I would only now ask you, please go to the foyer, speak with each other, keep the mood going on, have a coffee, have some vegan catering, which is made by a great woman here. She's caring about us all 4 days, and she's doing great stuff, and also in favor of basic income, so she's very modest with her money and so on. So please enjoy it here, and see you in the hall again at 4 p.m. Even more people are coming. Thank you a lot. And I would,
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was great being here with you. Thanks.
Have a great afternoon yet, and we will hopefully speak together later, Gabi. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.